Good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome to this STUC event, A Parcel of Rogues, about pandemic profiteers. I was delighted to see that so many people were interested in this important subject. We've got trade union members, we've got union representatives, we've got activists across the country that have signed up for this evening to find out more about the economic impact of the COVID crisis in Scotland and what responses trade unions can make to that now. The STUC is Scotland's trade union centre. We represent over 500,000 workers in every industry and region across Scotland through our affiliated trade union members. I'm Linda Somerville, I'm the Deputy General Secretary of the STUC, and I'm delighted to introduce our speakers this evening. First, we will hear from Laurie Macfarlane, who's the Economics Editor at openDemocracy, a Fellow at UCL, Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. Laurie has written widely about rethinking economics and what needs to change in Scotland. We'll also be joined by Richard Hardy, who's the National Secretary for Prospect Trade Union in Scotland and a former Just Transition Commissioner, and by Jennifer McCary, Chair of Glasgow Trades Council, Unison and Eco Pay Fighter. Both Richard and Jennifer are on the STUC General Council and have contributed to a new strategy from the General Council and for the STUC about how we're going to build our movement in Scotland in response not only to the current crisis, but ongoing. So we'll hear from our speakers for the first section of this evening, and we also plan to have time for questions and some answers from our panel at the end. So please do use the chat function, add your questions as we go along, but I would request that the questions are kept short and so that we can display them back to everybody. I mean, you'll all have different reasons for joining the event tonight. Some are interested in economics, some in the trade union response, and some just out of curiosity to find out what we meant by the parcel of rogues. But as the COVID crisis took hold last year, I mean, it was workers across the country that faced all the challenges, and many of them in their roles at work, many literally putting their lives at risk in order to help society and to protect us all. And it was well documented, it was on the news, and quite rightly so, we pay tribute to those workers. Trade unions are at the forefront of that in terms of protecting workers and all of our communities and families. But beyond this, there were shifts happening all around us. Money stayed in the pockets of some, but others struggled. Jobs changed as well, as some sectors stalled or closed, and some expanded. And it was these issues that the STUC felt were important to find out more about. What were these economic changes? Who were the winners and losers from COVID? And what could be done about it? I'd like now to hand over to Laurie, our first speaker, to outline the findings from the research that we commissioned and to hear his thoughts. Thank you, Laurie.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Linda. I'm hoping you can all see my screen now, but if you can't, then do somebody let me know. Yeah, thanks very much. It's great to be able to join the discussion and really share some of the findings from the results of the research that both Christine and I did for the STUC. Christine, unfortunately, was supposed to join, but she's ill today, so she's not able to do that. In the time we've got, what I want to do is just try and give a very sort of brief high-level overview of the key findings of the research that Christine and I did. The report was quite long, and so inevitably I'm going to have to sort of skip over some bits and only give a very top-level view, but hopefully we can get into some of the other details that people are interested in the Q&A. The research was also done, I think it came out in springtime, and so I think the key conclusions from the report still very much stand up, although some of the data in there is obviously slightly dated. So I've done my best in the slides to try and update that picture where I've been able to. But just to kick things off then, clearly the big sort of overview of the pandemic is that it was a major shock to the economy, triggered the deepest downturn on record in terms of GDP. This shows what's happened to GDP in Scotland. Since then, we've seen a sort of modest recovery. It's gone up and down that sort of mimicked some of the restrictions on the pandemic. Now, clearly, the cost of the pandemic has not been shared evenly across society. And really what we wanted to do in this work, as Linda just said, is to look at how the pandemic has changed the economy, look at who's who's been hit the hardest from it, and actually who is it that's actually been benefiting in some ways from it, and really sort of unpick that as much as we possibly can. Now, unusually for this economic crisis, unemployment, at least so far, has been somewhat suppressed by the furlough scheme, by the job retention scheme, and this just shows what's happened since May last year in terms of the share of workers on the furlough scheme. And you see it's gone up and down again, sort of mimicking the severity of the pandemic. Clearly, there's a big question which we can come back to about what will happen once that's fully unwound, and the risk that will have on employment in Scotland and elsewhere. Now, one of the things that we looked at initially was the sort of standard sectoral analysis, so looking at how the pandemic's impacted different standard categories of sectors in Scotland's economy. And we did a bit of that in the report, but what we found is that doesn't really tell you the full picture, because it doesn't really capture the key sort of structural changes that the pandemic has either generated or accelerated. And even within some sectors, you have some firms that have done very well and some that haven't, depending on very specific characteristics, like actually what products they sell, how they get their products to their customers, that isn't really captured by the standard sectoral classification. And at the same time, the pandemic's also had a big impact at the household level in terms of household finances, household balance sheets, which has major consequences on the shape of the recovery. And so we wanted to look at that as well. And so what we've done, we decided to look and identify about 6 key structural shifts that have taken place during the pandemic that have really changed the way that the economy is working, changing the circulation of both income and expenditure around the economy, and then look at who is that benefiting, who has actually stood to benefit from these changes, and then look at, is this just a temporary thing, or can we expect to see sustained, lasting structural changes both to Scotland's economy and then Scotland's labour market. And then finally, we'll come on to talk about some potential solutions, both in terms of what trade unions can be doing, trade union activists, and also what government policymakers should be doing as well. So the first sort of major structural shift that we identified is the rise, or the accelerated rise, I should say, of online retail. As you can see from this chart, online sales have been increasing for quite some time. It's not something that's new in and of itself. Retail sales have been shifting away from high streets online at a fairly steady pace. Unsurprisingly, though, when we saw lockdowns introduced, shops not allowed to open, we saw a dramatic spike in the amount of activity and sales that shifted online. And you can see that's still much higher even now than it was before the pandemic hit. Now, the biggest winner from this, unsurprisingly, has been your sort of major international e-commerce firm, basically Amazon, who's done incredibly well out of the pandemic, who's seen its revenues and profits soar dramatically. Amazon obviously does have a big presence in the UK and in Scotland. It doesn't really pay much tax because it manages to funnel its profits through Luxembourg. But in Scotland, obviously, it has a significant presence in employment in terms of warehouse distribution centres and things like that. And Amazon's also made it clear that it's going to be, it sees significant growth in the UK, and it's going to be trying to increase its presence and employment in the months and potentially years to come. There are, as well as Amazon, which we'll come back to, there are some UK online retailers that have done very well at the same time. So here I've just got Boohoo and ASOS, which are the 2 sort of major online retailers who've done very well from the pandemic. You can see profits, this is pre-tax profits, have spiked pretty tremendously compared to previous years as shoppers have turned away from high streets and turned online. Interestingly, we've also, at the same time as these companies doing very well, we've also seen a number of major high street brands fail during the pandemic. So Arcadia Group, that have a lot of brands under that group, as well as things like Debenhams also. And we've seen the likes of Boohoo and ASOS sort of swoop in and actually buy up these brands, not necessarily buy up the stores, but buy up the brands. And so this shift is one of the ones which I think is probably more likely to be sustained beyond the pandemic. And it was kind of something that was happening anyway, with just the pandemic, because of the circumstances, have led to that dramatic acceleration. There's also, in terms of, I just came across this not too long ago, actually, one Scottish company which seems to be doing very well, although it's not a listed company, so we don't know the details, but Atterly, which is a Scottish-based online fashion retail firm, has been raising lots of money and seeing sales boom during the pandemic as well. Now, in terms of retail, obviously this raises quite a lot of questions, which we'll come back to. One is the question of employment. Obviously, as if the growth of online retailers like Amazon, like Boohoo, like ASOS, which don't have much of a presence in Scotland, is happening at the expense of physical high street retail, then that probably does have will potentially have quite a significant impact on employment if we're seeing places shut down and that activity shifting online, where not necessarily much of that in terms of employment and things are happening in Scotland. The second thing is obviously the extent to which these companies are actually employing people. In the case of companies like Amazon, but also in Boohoo and ASOS, I'm sure many on this call will know, have issues with exploitative labour practice, with poor working conditions. Obviously, Amazon in particular has been well documented in terms of the treatment of its staff. And so the extent to which online retail is going to be a growth sector, there are real concerns there about what the quality of that work is going to be and what kind of work it's replacing, what kind of work that's coming at the expense at. And we'll come on to talk about more about what that means in the conclusion. The second key sort of structural shift that I identified is the shift in spending on social activities. So things like bars, pubs, clubs, restaurants, entertainment, hotels, travel, all that kind of stuff, to spending on at-home goods and services. So again, to be expected, given that many of these social activities were either prohibited or had quite significant restrictions placed on them during the pandemic. And so people instead spent more money on things like takeaways, on things like streaming services, on things like specialist food and drink providers, DIY stores, all that kind of stuff, again, which is to be expected. Now, again, one of the main beneficiaries from that has been Amazon, which is, you'll see, will be a common theme throughout this. But again, there are some sort of specific more in terms of UK companies. So B&M, which is a discount retailer, which also has significant home stores, has done very well. People going there to spend more on spending on things to do in their house, DIY, that kind of thing. And Kingfisher, that's the company that owns B&Q. So again, B&Q was struggling before the pandemic. It's rebounded quite strongly. It's had very strong revenue growth and delivered very strong profits during the pandemic. Again, largely because of people sitting at home and really wanting to, do things while on lockdown to their house. In terms of what the long-term implications of this, I think this is probably more of a temporary shift that's a symptom really of the lockdown. And I think we're already starting to see, as restrictions are lifted, spending on social activities, bars, restaurants, things like that, starting to recover. Although, as some people probably will be slightly more hesitant to go out and socialise in the way they did before, as long as we've got a pandemic going on. And so I think we might not see a full recovery anytime soon in these sectors, but certainly heading in that direction as we speak. The third sort of major shift that we highlight in the research is the rise in home working. And obviously this has been quite dramatic. Even now, this chart shows the most recent data that we have. Certainly in some sectors, there are large proportions of the workforce that are still working at home, that are not going into the office. Largely in professional services jobs, things like information, communication, professional, scientific, technical services and things like that. But throughout the pandemic, we've seen that increase across many, many sectors. Now, this has quite a big impact in terms of the type of economic activity that takes place and, crucially, where it takes place. It also has an impact in terms of sort of driving inequalities in the labour market, because the types of jobs that can be more easily done at home tend to be jobs, are often jobs that are better paid. So as you saw in the previous chart, the jobs on the left-hand side here, these are often the kinds of jobs that can be done at home, from your laptop, professional services jobs and that kind of thing. And so these jobs, which are often higher paid, they've been more likely to be able to maintain their incomes during the pandemic and to not being laid off or not being furloughed. Whereas the jobs that can't be done at home, in some cases, as this chart here shows, are often jobs that were lower paid anyway. And so lower paid jobs have been more likely to either been furloughed or laid off. And that sort of reinforced some of the inequalities that the pandemic's been driving. It also has a sort of geographic component. This chart's quite striking. This shows the index of multiple deprivation against the percent of residents who can work from home. And what it basically shows is the more deprived the area, the less number of people are able to work from home. And you can see, anyone who does statistics knows that a fit that's that neat is actually quite rare. And so what we're seeing again here is people, places that are perhaps more prosperous are able to have more people who are working from home, spending money in the local economy. Places that are less prosperous having more people who've either been laid off or furloughed, and they're spending less money in the local economy. And this is then played out in terms of how the sort of geographic dynamics of economic activity. So these diagrams here are taken from a study that was done looking at how the pandemic's displaced economic activity in cities. And what we see here is just for Edinburgh and Glasgow. The darker the red shows the estimated negative impact in employment that the pandemic's had, and the darker the blue is the increase in employment that the pandemic has had. And so what this is basically showing is that city centres have been in Scotland have been seeing less economic activity take place, and that's been pushed out often to residential suburbs, which is what some of the blue shaded areas are. And again, whether this is a temporary shift or whether this is going to last, have a lasting impact, has quite an important impact on the shape of the economic recovery that we're going to see. But again, I'll come back to that at the end. The fourth sort of structural shift that we highlight is the build-up of household savings. So one of the major changes that the pandemic triggered is that because many businesses were basically forced to close and households were basically restricted to their houses, what people were spending, household spending fell quite significantly. Although spending on essentials like food and things like that sustained, discretionary spending on things like eating out, socializing, bars, restaurants really fell off a cliff. And what that meant was that, particularly for households who managed to maintain their incomes during the pandemic, which is, as I said before, predominantly either middle or higher income earning households and also pensioners, they ended up building up significant household savings. And this shows what's happened to the savings ratio, which has spiked at an unprecedented rate. But unsurprisingly, this has been distributed very unevenly. And so this shows across the income distribution, with the lowest income households on the left to the highest income households on the right. This isn't actually in the paper because this data has only come out since, but this shows how savings have been concentrated across the income distribution. So the highest income households saving on average over £3,000, the lowest income households on average saving only £27. And that's largely because the higher income in general, sort of higher income households spend more on the types of social activities that have been prohibited during the pandemic. Now, clearly at the same time, many have faced greater economic hardship. So this is data that was published by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, that 28% of people in work in Scotland before the pandemic have either been furloughed, lost their job, had their working hours reduced, or lost self-employment income. And that overall 30% of all adults, including those not in work before the pandemic, have seen their incomes fall since the pandemic began. And clearly that hasn't been, the cost of that hasn't been spread evenly either. So lower income households, women, disabled people, and those many ethnic minorities being disproportionately impacted. So again, we see the pandemic having that sort of driving that wedge through society, exacerbating the inequalities that were there before. So some high income households sitting there actually finding their bank balances are getting larger and larger every month during the pandemic, while at the same time, many who were struggling before the pandemic finding they ended up in an even more precarious position. The fifth structural trend that we identify is rising asset prices. And so we've had this sort of paradoxical position where, on the one hand, we're supposed to be in the deepest economic downturn on record, while at the same time, we've seen house prices rise, at the fastest pace that we've seen in over 15 years. And this sort of separation, basically, from what's happening in the real economy from what's happening to asset prices. Now, in terms of who's benefited from this, well, property developers, estate agents, obviously they were shut basically during the first lockdown, so they couldn't operate, and so they obviously did see revenues collapse. Although since the markets opened up again in the back end of last year, developers, estate agents have been doing very well as we've entered this sort of quite strange mini housing boom. In terms of what's caused that, we've had a range of things. So the pent-up demand from the lockdown, the accumulation of household savings that I just talked about, wealthier households who've ended up, sitting on piles of cash have thought, well, why don't I invest either scale up my house or buy a second property. Houses of people who've been locked up in their house for months during the lockdown, thinking, oh, I want to move out the city, I want a garden, what's been dubbed the race for space. Loose monetary policy, QE, lower interest rates as well. But it's also been actively stimulated by government policies. So the UK, both the UK and the Scottish government, cutting stamp duty, or in Scotland, land and buildings transaction tax, which basically had the effect of sort of fueling house prices, at least to some extent, although in Scotland that's now been phased out. The commercial real estate sector is slightly more complicated. City centre commercial real estate, big investors in city centre real estate have been hit quite hard during the pandemic. There is nearly £5 billion of commercial rent has gone unpaid since the pandemic began. Unsurprisingly, as high street retailers and offices have seen, have been hit through rise in remote working, decline in footfall, and the rise in online retail. But at the same time, there has been elements of the commercial real estate sector that have actually done quite well, particularly some of the more niche sectors. So real estate investors in things like warehousing, for example, have done very, very well. A couple of companies that we highlight in the report invest in big warehouses and lease it out to companies like Amazon, like Ocado, like some of the supermarkets who are selling online. They've done very, very well. But at the moment, I think a key determinant really of, in terms of who wins and who loses is who's made to absorb the cost of the crisis in terms of things like rent arrears. So whether the state intervenes or not to steer the recovery in a particular direction, to say, actually, we're going to have at least a partial write-off of rent arrears to protect some of the businesses, or whether they say, actually landlords are going to be within the rights to try and collect unpaid rent in full. So that's still playing out. I think that's a key dividing line that we're still yet to see the conclusion of. In terms of asset prices, we've also seen global stock markets soar again. At a time when actually the real economy has been contracting. Less so the FTSE 100 in the UK, which actually hasn't done very well, but global stock markets, particularly in the US, Japan, have soared. And in terms of who's benefited from that, once again, this chart here shows in terms of across the wealth distribution in the UK. Quite striking here. This chart shows the change in wealth per adult as a result of asset price changes since the onset of the pandemic. And you can see in the richest 10%, on average, have seen the wealth increase by over £44,000 just because of rising asset prices. So that's rising house prices and rising share prices, which has boosted their share portfolios or pensions. Right down the bottom end of the distribution, of course, those at the bottom end haven't seen any change in their wealth, and in many cases have ended up finding themselves further in debt. In terms of who's benefited from this in sort of business sense, if there was one industry to highlight that has done the best in Scotland from the pandemic, it would be Scotland's asset management sector, which is a key component of the financial sector in Scotland. Some big asset managers based in Edinburgh. Two I've highlighted here: Scottish Mortgage Investment Trust and the Edinburgh Worldwide Investment Trust. They're both publicly listed investment trusts that are managed by Baillie Gifford, one of the big firms in Edinburgh. And in both cases, they've seen their pre-tax profits increase by nearly 800% during the pandemic. But that's largely because they were heavily invested in US tech stocks, both things like Amazon, but also Tesla, companies who've seen their share price soar during the pandemic. And because these are big investors in these companies, the returns to these trusts have increased dramatically as well. So that's something which, in terms of parts of the economy that have done particularly well, that's one definitely to highlight. The final sort of structural shift that we highlight, which is probably the most tentative one, is reshoring of manufacturing supply chains. And so the pandemic really was a wake-up call to many, I think, in terms of just how fragile the reliance on complex international supply chains are when it comes to things like the goods and services that we need. And obviously this was most visible in the PPE race to get PPE at the beginning of the pandemic. At the beginning of the pandemic, Scotland basically produced hardly any PPE and was really desperately trying to source some from abroad. And in the paper, we outline the sort of process that the government went through to try and rapidly develop local supply chains of PPE. which eventually they got there in the end. And now, Scotland produces a decent amount of the PPE that we actually use. But broader than just PPE, there is some evidence in Scotland and across the UK that companies, and broader than that, have looked at the pandemic and sort of seen that as a bit of a wake-up call, and have sort of decided to try and look at, or at least explore, the potential for reshoring manufacturing, and saying, actually, we want to look at whether we can produce things closer to home rather than rely on the complex global supply chains from a sort of resilience perspective. And we highlight some examples of where this might be happening in the report, but crucially, this is an area where it's kind of policy dependent. And I think, the Scottish Government could and has to some extent already seen this as an opportunity, and really, policy can really help accelerate this, develop more local supply chains, and obviously create new high-skilled jobs here in Scotland. So just to kind of sum up briefly, I know that's quite a lot of information and quite a lot of slides, but just to kind of recap, many of the biggest winners from the pandemic have been global, often US-based sort of tech or e-commerce companies. So the likes of Amazon, but also companies like Microsoft, Apple, and things like that. And obviously, in some cases, in things like Amazon, the growth of these companies is in many cases happening at the expense of local economy spending. People are no longer spending on local high street; they're spending on Amazon. That's not much of that money staying in the local economy. The long-term impact of the pandemic depends largely on the extent to which some of the trends that we highlighted, so the shift to remote working, depressed social spending, rise of online retail, the extent to which that's actually sustained after the pandemic subsides, or whether we basically revert back to the way things worked before the pandemic. If this is sustained, then obviously this will cause some disruption, particularly challenges for some city centres, high streets, parts of the commercial property sector, and will also have an impact on employment, particularly in some sectors. The other thing just to highlight again, to stress, is that some of the pandemic sort of growth sectors that I talked about, online retail, warehousing, if these are the industries where there is perhaps going to be growth, we obviously need to be concerned about poor job quality and exploitation in these sectors. And certainly from a trade union organising perspective, should be thinking about what we can do to enhance paying conditions in these sectors, if they are going to be sectors where we are going to see more jobs created in the future. Again, just to reinforce that the COVID pandemic, and to some extent Brexit, has put more attention on reshoring to reduce dependence on global supply chains. And potentially this is an opportunity for Scotland, which I'll touch on a bit more in a second in terms of policy solution. Importantly, how the savings that have been built up during the pandemic are actually spent could have quite an important impact on the shape of the recovery. So the Bank of England estimated that about £180 billion has been saved up across the UK, probably about 15 to 16 billion of that in Scotland. Clearly, if that money is all spent on holidays or potentially in online retail, places like Amazon, much of that's just going to leave the economy permanently and probably not have much of an impact. If it's channeled locally or it's managed to be to channel into local investment, then clearly the impact of that on the local economy could be much more significant. But overall, the sort of key message, I think, from the report that we'd kind of stress is that the overall shape of the recovery really is policy dependent, and there's quite a lot of political choice here that the government can make in terms of how it should, which direction it wants to steer the recovery in. And it seems like the UK government is basically sort of banking on getting people out spending in the shops, spending online, and also stoking the housing market as its sort of key strategy. So the question is, what should the Scottish Government's approach be, and how should that be different? And this just sums up really the what I was saying about the tensions here between the key uncertainties between returning to business as usual or shifting to a new normal, and things like office working, physical retail versus online retail, social spending, and offshoring. Okay, so just very briefly, and conscious of time, so I'm just going to quickly sum up some of the sort of findings that are recommendations that we outlined, both for trade union organising and policy. So in terms of trade union organising, in terms of the impact of the labour market, we recommend that unions should be proactively engaging with the government and encouraging quite an active, robust industrial strategy to focus on creating jobs in the industries of the future, maximising the potential for reshoring where there is potential to do that, ensuring that laid off workers are supported through reskilling, retraining, perhaps in some of the sectors that have been hit most from the pandemic, and also developing strategies, crucially, as I said before, in sectors that have sort of grown during the pandemic, that are characterised by low-paid, insecure work. You know, really thinking about how unions can really organise in that sector to improve paying conditions. In terms of the rise of home working, this raises a whole bunch of issues for unions in terms of, in terms of how the cost of that is shared. Some employers might see that as an advantage to basically shift costs from the employers onto the employee. Surveillance technology, how things like digital presenteeism and things like balancing work with care, all this kind of stuff is going to be really key. I think it's only going to get more important as time goes on. And there's also the issue, of course, is that resisting pressure from companies to and the government to push people back into the office before they feel safe. We've already seen quite a lot of lobbying from things like the commercial property sector, who really want desperately to get people back into the office so that people can start spending and their rent can get paid. So again, thinking about how that can be resisted and really putting the public health first rather than the profits of the commercial real estate sector. And in terms of asset prices, this sort of trend, the disparity between asset prices and living standards, we recommend basically reinforcing the need for a whole worker organising approach. So rather than unions just looking at their working conditions of their members, also concerning themselves with broader things like access to affordable housing, like affordable credit, because these things are now becoming an increasingly important part of people's living standards. So looking at that bigger picture as well as just the workplace. And then in terms of policy, as I said before, ensuring support for sectors that have been impacted by the pandemic that cannot be expected to recover. So again, things like we don't want to have a cliff edge with things like the furlough scheme, which might lead to a sort of spike in unemployment, a harmful spike in unemployment that could be avoided. Again, helping people with retraining, reskilling, continued lobbying to try and get devolution of employment law and using this to tackle the issues of home working. And then, as I mentioned before, both on the union side and policy, really sort of steering the government towards taking a pretty robust approach to industrial strategy. The Scottish Government set out plans to do this 10-year strategy for economic transformation. And really, I think the key here is to try and make sure that that is actually a strategy for economic transformation rather than something that's sort of papering over the cracks or a return to business as usual. And I've outlined some bullets there, some of the things we mentioned in the report, but I won't go through them. And in terms of high streets and local economies, so I think rather than sort of trying to move back to the world before the pandemic of office working and city centre retail, although some of that might come back, focus really should be on regenerating local high streets, and this was an issue before the pandemic anyway. So things like repurposing offices or empty shops as shared spaces, creating local working hubs, investing in things like local amenities, some of them that have been stripped back in recent years, helping local businesses actually to offer services online so that people don't need to go to Amazon. And then the final thing is just about tackling the inequalities that have been sharpened by the pandemic. As I've tried to outline, the pandemic's really exacerbated many of the inequalities that were there before the pandemic, and those who were suffering or struggling before the pandemic are likely to be those who are struggling even more now. And so government really needs to be taking an approach to try and remedy some of these injustices, things like debt relief for those who've been pushed further into debt, looking at what you do with rent arrears, both in terms of businesses and for private tenants, again, who've been one of the worst hit from the pandemics, things like rent controls going forward, and continuing where we can to basically diverge from the UK government's policy of trying to stoke up the housing market. And it's good that the Scottish Government has sort of taken a slightly better approach to things like stamp duty than the UK government. And crucially, making full use of all the devolved powers that we have, crucially tax powers to sort of remedy some of these injustices, things like council tax, income tax, all these things, using them to the full potential in order to try and make sure that we can do our best to remedy some of the inequalities that have increased during the pandemic. So I'm going to stop there. I'm conscious that was a lot of information. And again, there's much more in the report that I haven't been able to cover, but hopefully in the discussion we can get into some of the things that people are interested in. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Laurie. I think it was really important to hear all of that, and it's a really stark exposure of the inequalities that we probably knew a lot of them pre-existing in society, but the graphs that you've shown, particularly the correlation about areas of multiple deprivation, I hadn't seen that one before, so it's really stark. It also, I think, shows the disproportionate impact as well that we've seen, particularly on women and young workers and Black and ethnic minority workers, in the labour market, and how that's actually changed. So the pandemic's far from over. I mean, and we are at a very crucial point, a point of change. Lots of workers are returning to work. Many have never been away from work. Their lives have continued pretty much as usual. But also we do have a new parliament. We've now got the SNP and Green agreement that came out last week. Lots of things to unpick in there. But there's huge issues for workers going forward. And how do we actually take this moment of crisis and coming out of the crisis to make sure that some of our ideas are on the table? So I'd now like to invite Richard to reflect both on the research, but especially look at the opportunities that there are for trade union organising.
Thanks, Linda, and thanks, Laurie, for that incredibly detailed report, and we're looking at and using that in Prospect. I mean, just a quick background for those of you that are not probably aware of Prospect. We operate in that professional sector. Largely with quite a big area in the creative sector. I'm going to try and do this as quick as I can so that we get some room for debate. There's some issues which I think are really key for us here. Our experience in the pandemic was we saw a very, very rapid recruitment surge in March and April of last year, but that really has tailed off. And I think if we're going to make sure that we win the battle for the new economy and the new workplaces, so that workers are benefiting and not just all of the organisations that Laurie has picked up, there's a couple of things I think we've really got to think about. How do we organise where in a new way of working, where we have not got that solidarity in a workplace because we're seeing much more of a hybrid work approach? I think all unions have got really, really, really good at communicating with their members. I think we've all seen vast improvements through the use of digital communications in terms of our outreach and our engagement with reps and members. But how are we going to reach the people that we need to recruit if they're not in workplaces, or they're separated and isolated from a sense of collective? And we've been working around some work on right to disconnect and how we use that as a way of organising. But I think we've also got to reflect that some of the new employment, particularly in the tech sector, we're running a project in tech sector at the moment in Prospect, that actually our traditional way of working might not be as attractive to those workers as it is to our traditional membership. So we're finding that some people in the tech sector are actually not all that bothered about collective bargaining, but they want us to be the arbiter of a workspace in terms of their ability to get their access and the information that they need. So, how do we organize in that new workspace? How do we make sure that we're doing this cooperatively, so that actually what we're not having is unions falling out over the same group of workers, but also picking up something that Laurie said about our engagement and our campaigning around things like affordable housing and societal change? That's quite a crowded space already. So how do we do that cooperatively with people that are already there? Or how do we amplify the voices of those campaigns that are already there and build upon their membership base? Got to remember as well, when we're talking about the public health situation, we shouldn't be, we should rightly be saying the public health and the health of our workers is vital. But there's a balance between making workplaces impossible to get into, and the fact that for us, lots of our members are working in those spaces where people might be put off. So, in terms of around the creative sector, how do we balance off that public health against economic harm? Couple of other things, and then I'll pass on to Jennifer. Onshoring and offshoring. It will be great if we can onshore some of that manufacturing that's gone offshore. But we also need to be aware that the more, particularly in our sector, the more that we can show that we can work remotely, the more there is a risk of employers going, okay, so why does that need to be done in the UK? I've seen recently Ocado, some of you may have seen Ocado offering you the ability, offering their staff to go and work abroad for a month. I've seen a document from Renault this morning that says you'll be able to work from anywhere in the world. Now, that's great, but we need to lock that in so that doesn't become, well, it's quite expensive for you to do that, but we could actually get it done in Bangalore for an awful lot cheaper. And there will be governments in places like India and in Malaysia who will be throwing money into this sector to encourage the sort of offshoring that we saw around call center work. So there are benefits and there are challenges. And I'd like to have that conversation about new ways of organizing and making sure that we win this battle for our members. And actually the only benefit, we know that what companies are saying is, well, you're getting a benefit because you're not coming in the office 3 days a week. Actually, that's not winning the battle. So I'm gonna stop. Again, thank Laurie for that brilliant piece of work, and pass on to Jennifer.
Thanks very much, Richard. That was excellent. I think you've already covered some of the ground and some of the questions that were in people's heads, particularly about how do we organise amongst home workers, because those people that are not going to get the opportunity to go back to the office or find that they're pushed into those situations, how do we begin to recruit those new workers as well? Jennifer, do you want to reflect both on what we've heard, but also I think thinking more widely about how does this interact when we look at the whole worker approach? What does that mean for us actually thinking about communities and where people are living in terms of their workplaces?
Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Richard. And thanks, Laurie, so much for you and Christine's work, and to the STUC for commissioning this really important report. And I really would urge people to have a look at it, because it's very much about getting to the truth of the matter about the economics of the pandemic. And I think it's very important that we unpick that as a society, because the narrative which is commonly told is that we've all suffered equally. And although I'm sure there's no family that's not suffered great loss and tragedy in the pandemic, there are some people who've suffered economically more than others, and there are some people who frankly have made masses of profit out of this pandemic. And that's a real reflection on the way that Scotland is structured. So I just wanted to pick up on a few themes that I think are really important for everybody in Scotland who lives in rural communities or towns or cities, villages. There are lessons here to be learned for all of us in our communities. And one of I think the first lessons to be learned was the immediate kind of response of business. I mean, in our city in Glasgow, we have particular issues around poverty, but that's echoed all over Scotland, but it's particularly intense in our city. And of course, we know that working poverty is a massive issue. And what we saw initially was much of some hospitality, hotels, and that kind of employer rallying to dismiss, rallying to protect their interests. And actually, the people who stuck up for those workers were trade unions who tried to assist people to collectivise, and the people who won those fights in the Scottish Exhibition Centre so that they were not dismissed but actually took on as a workforce in some of the hotel groups, not just in Glasgow but across the UK, were workers who hadn't actually organised in trade unions before, coming together with help and assistance to collectively raise disputes and win the right to furlough. So I think there's an important lessons to be learned for that, for organising, and I think that's particularly relevant to say tonight because tonight we're possibly on the verge of quite an interesting development in one of the largest unions in the UK in terms of organising and the way that pans out in terms of leadership elections. So it's important that we think about what the instincts of large employers were, and also how that's played out in the report, because we've seen a large increase in the use of tactics like fire and rehire. And this isn't just in kind of small hospitality companies. I mean, this is Tesco's, this is British Gas, this is large companies who in some cases have maintained their income or made profits and have used the pandemic to undermine sometimes key workers' paying conditions. But subsidies, of course, trickled down, didn't they? And I know that in Glasgow, we gave out, I think, in the region, the last report that we got, and I sat in the COVID recovery group on behalf of the trade union movement in our city, and at the last count we got, which before the group was concluded, was around April this year, and up until then, £219 million had been given out to in subsidy to businesses in Glasgow. Not the same conditionality that you would get if you applied for universal credit. Certainly you weren't put to the test. There was no conditionality. That means that we didn't ensure that those employers paid a living wage. We didn't ensure that they used that money to make workers redundant. We didn't make sure that that money went to making sure that good work was kept intact in our communities. There was no conditionality at all. And that we really need to think about the way that public funds are being used in our towns and cities, because if we see a deterioration in the kind of jobs that we have through an increase in the use of zero-hour contracts and an increase in fire and rehire tactics, then the public money, the public purse that comes out of our pockets and the pockets of citizens can't be used to subsidise that kind of behaviour. And at the moment, frankly, it is. And it's not being used in a way that targets decent, good work that our communities are desperate for. The second lesson that I thought was worth highlighting is about public transport and about how public transport really matters in our communities, how services were reduced, how that impacted on key workers, how buses particularly really matter, and in our city, how much of, for instance, in Glasgow, like many towns and villages across Scotland and other cities, it's private operators who operate the bus services. And what we saw is that they, in 2020, received £300 million in public subsidies. That meant their profits were kept intact. Now, we cannot have a situation where those profits are more important than making sure that people who provide absolutely key services during a pandemic are not sheltered from zero-hour contracts and poor working conditions. And finally, what I think that I'd like to highlight is the incredibly important role that, like, perhaps three strands play in economy, in our economy, but also how they play into the economy of the pay packet, the economy that runs our homes and our families, and that is the living wage, and how the living wage alone isn't enough. We need living hours, because the right to disrupt contracts and to not give people enough hours to rely on, or the use of rotas, short notice rotas, to undermine people's ability to plan and have decent lives, and also living rent. The importance of having some security around the privately rented sector has impacted massively across cities, towns and villages in Scotland, particularly in our city, in Glasgow and Edinburgh and Dundee and places like this. The private rented market has been largely subsidised in terms of interest-free loans, but those who have relied on the private rented market have seen rents soar with little or no protections. We hope that will change out the new proposals. So in terms of our reflection on where that puts us in terms of whole worker organising, that's a term you hear. What does that mean? It means that the trade union movement is here with an agenda that addresses not only pay, but security of employment, the right to decent work, and also the importance of stability in communities that the right to decent, fair rents would ensure. So I think we need a lot more political courage. I think we're faced with a lot more stark choices. And I think that what we need to make sure as a movement that we can put pressure on all our politicians, not just at Scottish Government level, not just at a UK level, but particularly at council level, that that ordinary people deserve much better representation in terms of where the money goes and what it delivers for ordinary communities across Scotland.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was excellent. I mean, I think you've laid out there, you know, you're right to actually quantify the amount of government cash that has gone into business grants, whether that's in Glasgow or in other places across Scotland, and where that, you know, where that money's been targeted. But also, I think we need to note as well that much of the furlough money, which there was a, you know, the UK government made a great play about the money that they were handing out to people. Much of that furlough money and the grants to small businesses as well, the very small businesses, that's been a straight transfer actually to landlords. So again, where does that come in? Like, where has that money actually, you know, gone? If you follow the money, then that's often where it's ended up. We've had some really good contributions, and we do have a couple of questions, some that, that we were keen to ask of our panel, but we did have one submitted already. So if anybody's got any other comments or questions, then please stick them in. I think we'll run on till about 10 past, quarter past, if that's okay with people. So the first question that we had was about education, and I was going to ask Laurie this specifically, which is really from Sarah Jan Robertson, and the question is around who's profited within the education sector. You know, how do we add up the impact both of teaching hours in FB or the loss of jobs in teaching hours? So I suppose there's a slightly wider question than that. It's who's profited within the education sector, but wider than that, within the public sector, when you think about the amount of extra work and goodwill that people have taken on, how would we begin to quantify that? Because that's not seen in our balance sheets.
Yeah, good question. I mean, the first thing to say is that in the report, education wasn't one of the areas that we looked at because it's focused on private sector, and so we didn't look at some of the public sector side. But yeah, clearly, I think it's key. And obviously, one of the things that we have seen in terms of education was pushing students back, arguably, you know, to things like university as well, basically to satisfy the interests of landlords, basically to prioritising the interests of those to collect rent over the sort of basic public health rights of students, you know, to live properly. And on the broader public sector side of things, yeah, I mean, I think clearly what the pandemic has done is really highlighted just how, you know, what the impact of a decade of austerities plus has had on sort of eroding public sector capacity, public sector expertise. And so we've been left in a position that we weren't that well prepared. But it's highlighted just how important public sector workers are, both teachers, whether it's teachers in education or whether it's in the health sector, absolutely vital, play an absolutely vital role in our economy. And outside the public sector, the whole issue of key workers as a concept, I think, has been really interesting development that we should really think about. Often key workers are those, in many cases, are those that aren't particularly well paid, and yet when it's come to the crunch, are those that we've defined as some of the most important. And so it's really highlighted the kind of topsy-turvy, how we've got things so wrong between actual value and contribution and reward. I think that's something that both, you know, as both as trade unionists and as policymakers, we should be really thinking about. Have we really got that balance right in terms of how people are actually getting paid in some of these roles?
Thanks, Laurie. I think that you're right about the amount of money that obviously the universities themselves, and then also, you know, the housing developers within that were very keen to have students back on campus. So, you know, there was definitely money that was being taken out for certain companies or indeed some of the public sector organisations that they were very, very reliant on. But I think about when you talked about the different types of workers and how the, you know, some of those that are seen as key workers and potentially before we wouldn't really have thought of them as that. And you mentioned, I know in your conclusions as well, around the large tech firms that have not only profited but is a growing, expanding sector in Scotland for employment. So I'd be interested to hear reflections from Jennifer and then Richard about, for these type of organisations, particularly these large, huge tech firms, where we don't at the moment have the tax powers that we need and we don't have the clout politically to potentially deal with them. How do we therefore organise workers in these industries when they're often thought to be impenetrable and indeed they have such a high turnover? So Jennifer, I'm interested in your comments on that, and then Richard.
I think it's very difficult to reflect on the profits that these companies have made without also reflecting on the very unjust value that's placed on the work that was and is continues to be key in society. And I think that you can't reflect on that without thinking about those who were at the coalface, you know, those who worked in care homes, those who worked with vulnerable people in our communities day after day, night after night, when others were sheltering behind their doors, you know, and then went back home to their families. And the pay that they get has not went up a penny. You know, they have worked at the coalface of a pandemic, and they have not received an increase in the value. Their work has not been valued financially a penny more. And that is incredibly important and significant. And also the fact that profit as a concept, the way that it can remain completely untouched from public responsibility. So, you know, it can zoom off from, you know, Lanarkshire or Aberdeen or, you know, Dundee into a pot of international capital with no recount to society or any public responsibility. And we had one of those questions in the list as well about how do you address rising property prices, asset prices, you know, this kind of almost capital that you can't contain or have any control over. And I think the answer to that is that we have to rebuild a wealth structure that relates to people and relates to community. And we have to prioritise that within our political structures and not just pay homage to principles like community wealth building, but really provide an infrastructure and examples of that really can be applied in local communities all across Scotland. And of course, we need to have tax raising powers over these large bodies, these large profit-making bodies that simply take money out of our communities and don't have any input back into it. So that's not the way any decent society works. You know, that's Victorian values. So we have to have a way of regenerating and generating an income back into our communities when money goes out. But the first step in that, I think, is really about getting to grips with community wealth building, and not in a tokenistic and small way, but in a really meaningful way in terms of how local economies work in Scotland.
Thanks, Jennifer. Richard?
I mean, we're involved in a project at the moment funded by the Union Modernisation Fund to look at organising in the tech sector, and it started off with us doing some work in the game sector, but it's expanded out to look at a number of other organisations. I think there's two key issues on this. Firstly is how we use fair work and conditionality to get a foot in the door of these workplaces, of these tech companies, because many of them are getting tax breaks. Many of them, are turning up and they're occupying space which is being provided by the Scottish Government. So, and Linda and I were on a call this morning about fair work with the Scottish Government and how we build on that. And I think that there's another question in the chat about how do we think the Green SNP deal will go? And I think the indications are fair work may well see an increase in importance in relation to that. So we need to look at building conditionality and building fair work together to challenge some of these tech workers. Some of them are startups, but some of them are quite big. The second thing, and this might be a little bit controversial, is we need to look at what we offer in the sector. Worker mobility in the sector is huge, and actually looking to recruit around issues in a workplace is too slow burn for quite a lot of the workers that we've been dealing with, because simply what they'll do is go and get a job somewhere else because the demand is there. And what we're seeing is that workers are joining the union. They're interested in what we do, but they're also interested in looking at new models of how we help them. And as I said, sometimes that's not that they're clamouring for collective bargaining, and you know, I'm not a great believer in moving away too far from collective bargaining. I'm a bit dyed in the wool and old myself for that. But if what we do is go into these workplaces and tell these workers this is what you need, and we don't listen to them, they'll turn off and they'll go somewhere else and get it. And you know what? There's a ton of apps out there already that are in this space, right? You want an answer, you want it, you know, a traditional worker, somebody at the Northern Lighthouse Board, for instance, who's out at a lighthouse, he's going to wait, or she's going to wait until tomorrow, and she's going to ring the rep. Tech workers won't do that. They're going to look online and they're going to want an answer, you know, 5 minutes before they thought of the question. So we need to look at what we're offering into that space, because if what we do is go in there and tell them what they want, they'll just turn off. Right now, sometimes it will be collective bargaining, and we're working towards collective bargaining with a couple of companies where we're slowly growing. But in other areas, what the workers are telling us is they want us to be the owner of information, honest information about rates, about who's a good employer, right? So they can come to us to make their own choices. Now, we already operate a little bit like that in the creative sector, where we run a I don't want to call it a don't go and work for them list, but because that sounds a bit dodgy, but it is a don't go and work for them list. But we also have rate cards. So if you go for a job as an electrician in a theatre, or a cameraman, or camera operative, right? You can come to Beck2, which is part of Prospect, and get a rate card. This is what we suspect you want to pay. Now, we're looking at building that for the tech sector, because I think that's what people are asking us. And then you take them on the journey to say, well, actually, collective bargaining, you know, might be an answer to that. But there is so much labour mobility that a traditional model of going in and organising around grievances might not be the answer. So we've got to be flexible, and we've got to think on our feet, and we've got to be agile. And the other thing we've got to not do is we can't have a bum fight amongst the trade union movement about who goes in there and who gets what. And we need to be honest and open. And actually, in Scotland, we're way ahead of that. I think we do really operate in a collegiate way. So those are two things for me. Look at our organising models and use the fair work conditionality terms and build on those.
Thanks, Richard. I suppose we've just got about 5 minutes left, so I wanted just to end on thinking, you know, coming back to one of Laurie's main points about, and I think it's one of the ones that, you know, some people might think is more controversial, not about the structural changes that we can make on a policy basis with government, you know, that we will all take those things forward in different ways, the ways that we will try and lobby government, and, you know, indeed the Greens with a new agreement to see what things we can take forward around fair work and other things. But actually, both for those that believe in taking forward some of the progressive organisations that we're involved in, and indeed for trade unions, when we talk about the whole worker approach, and I know Jennifer's come up with that, I think we need to come back and look at that, because never before have we seen more starkly than how our society is completely interlinked. You know, if you close schools, what impact does that have? If people don't have public transport to get to work, what impact does that have? When the health crisis, you know, hit us, we began to see things completely unfold in all different sectors of our society. So we can't separate out what we do for work as a different person to how we are in the rest of our community. And I think, you know, really thinking about the organising agenda, then look at that whole working approach is something that we need to take forward. And there's a slightly misty-eyed chat as well going around about, you know, community response. I heard someone else say this last week at an event I was speaking at around a public inquiry for COVID in Scotland. And what they were saying was there was a slightly misty kind of eyed chat around how communities all came together and knocked on neighbours' doors, and wasn't that wonderful? Well, it was, if you look at it that way. But what actually happened is people were making up food parcels to take to people because they couldn't afford food. They were trying to help their neighbours because there was no public services. The public services were stretched and couldn't manage it, not because workers weren't doing their best. So there was huge gaps in society, and often it was communities, and particularly women, that filled those gaps. So there's something there as well about how do we actually pull all that together. And Jennifer, you mentioned as well community wealth building, you know, and how do we keep that? What do we mean by the circular economy? What can we do to actually stop some of the money flooding out into the big multinationals or the global organisations that we've been talking about today? There's lots in there, but I'd ask you all just to give a final comment really about what's the one thing you think that we need to do, both as trade unions or indeed as progressive organisations, to take forward whole worker approach. So I'll start with Richard, Jennifer, and we'll finish with Laurie.
Thanks, Linda. It's not an area of expertise, so I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I think Laurie and Jennifer have clearly got lots more thoughts on this than me, so I'm gonna say I'm gonna pass on to Jennifer rather than try and wing it.
Okay, thank you. Jennifer.
Well, what I'm going to do is reflect on a point that our Trades Council in Glasgow and many other parts of the trade union movement have been making within the STUC and the trade union movement across the UK, which is that we are only as strong as the least powerful in our membership and in our sector and in our industry. And the fact that those who are employed in agency or precarious work or zero-hour contracts, those who are employed in organisations that receive public funds through grant funding, or who receive contracts from local authorities, who aren't given immediate protection by our collective bargaining structures, their experience is used to undermine all of us. And we have seen that in this pandemic, absolutely clearly. So the fact that the care workers in a care home, their wages are paid through local government and health board joint funding, but actually results in poverty pay, actually results in insecure contracts, actually results in unhealthy work practices that have impacted us all. So our movement needs to get much more serious, not just talk the talk, but develop serious strategies about organising those groups of workers, and that means resources. So I think that a big lesson for us in the trade union movement is that we need to be much more serious about successfully organising the unorganised who receive poverty pay as a result of being a step away from collective bargaining structures, and we need to get very serious about that. So we need that approach, but also I think we need some political reflection in Scotland, because we have this kind of social democratic consensus that says, we're really compassionate and we care about everybody, whether that's at a Scottish Government level or at a local government level. But as Laurie's research has shown, the impact of that, it doesn't stand up to scrutiny. We need much, much better results. And I think that we need to be inspired by some of the fantastic campaign and work that's been successful, both in organising our movement, but also in organising communities, like the Live and Rent campaign, and people like that who have, went in the way that we organise workplace by workplace, they've organised street by street to seek political reform and progress around private rented legislation and rent controls around the private rented sectors. So I think that we should watch, support those organisations and look to building alliances with them. Having the ear of politicians does not mean political success. Our movement is built on people, and our success is we're much more likely to be successful if we can bring our membership into that. So I think a lot more discussion with those kinds of organisations that are seeking to affect change that can really impact on our members and their families, rather than just only relying on political conversations with politicians. So it's back to campaigning effectively, building big strong alliances, and having a very clear vision of what change can make an impact in communities across Scotland.
Thanks, Jennifer. It's excellent. And I think also, the call to action that you've got there about the things that both unions can do, but what we can all do, I think that's really important, because, the research that we've got and really good recommendations for both unions and policymakers to reflect on, are not going to happen without people taking them forward. So thank you. And Laurie, any concluding remarks that you had, or also just any reflections you had specifically on that point about how do we link with communities further as trade unions, and how do we build their better alliances that we can actually win for workers and their families?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing is really to, for unions and union movement to be really thinking about basing strategies around how sort of capitalism is functioning, now in the 21st century, and particularly in the post-pandemic context, and how that impacts the way that sort of organise. I think not in all cases, but I think as a sort of generalisation, I think there's some elements of organising is sort of looking at the world as if it's in the 20th century, focusing on the workplace and certain types of workplace. I think organising in the workplace is obviously incredibly important, but getting to grips with the changing nature of the workplace. So as we talked about home working and things like that being important, but also looking at how things outside the workplace are also absolutely critical to people's living standards. So people are also being exploited by the landlords. They're also being exploited by, big tech firms at the moment. They're also being ripped off by, rip-off private transport providers and things like that. So really looking at that bigger picture about how it is that capitalism is sort of functioning and in many ways exploiting people. And I think, doing things like, the STUC putting together things like the People's Recovery, engaging in that sort of broader policy agenda and trying to get buy-in from across the labour movement in demand for some of these big things that are going to be absolutely critical for how people's living standards are, as well as obviously doing the important work of organising the workplace. And I think, that's really the direction of travel that I think we need to go in.
Thanks very much, Laurie, and thanks everyone for attending this evening. I think we've had lots of information that's a lot to take in, but also lots to unpick about how we actually go forward, because the research has to be practical to us. We have to have some actions to come out of it for both trade unionists and policymakers, and that's certainly been outlined. So thanks to Richard and to Jennifer for sharing your reflections and what trade unions can actually do, and also to Laurie and for Christine, who I know wasn't able to make it along tonight, for actually commissioning, for doing the research for us. So thanks very much, everybody, and good night.